St. Petersburg, capital of Russia, October the 25th, 1917. The time, 21 minutes to 10 in the evening. At anchor in the river Neva, the cruiser Aurora waits to take her place in history. In precisely 1 minute's time, her crew, led by Bolsheviks, will fire a shot to signal the attack on the Winter Palace. At other points in the old city, guns are trained on the last stronghold of the Russian government. On May the 14th, 1896, Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was crowned Tsar of all the Russias, and nearly 1,300 of his subjects were trampled to death in the crowd. In 1913, an imperial parade in the Kremlin celebrated the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. Over the centuries, little had changed. The Tsar and his family were answerable not to the people, but only to God. God had set the Romanovs on their throne, and God would secure it for them. The Tsar's only son, Alexis Nikolaevich, would, if he lived, inherit the throne. But he suffered from the incurable disease of hemophilia, and if he died, his sisters would preserve the succession. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. Dynasty must survive, and it must be preserved from democracy, a form of government which the Tsar detested.
I shall maintain the principle of autocracy just as firmly as it was preserved by my unforgettable dead father. Those who believe they can share in the government dream senseless dreams.
Tsarist Russia in the early years of the century had all the outward signs of a vast, impregnable, and rugged power. The great Kremlin citadel loomed as a reminder of the three forces which controlled the empire: the crown, the church, and the bureaucracy. For the 160 million people spread over a nation covering 1/6 of the world, there was no other authority. The scale and solidity of Moscow's architecture spoke for a society unswervingly confident of its own destiny. In this environment, a remarkable intellectual elite had emerged, and Russian music and literature reached a new peak of achievement. It was Russia's own writers, men like Gogol, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Chekhov, who first saw the shadows lengthening over their own doomed society. For the teeming millions of the Tsar's subjects, illiterate, impoverished, and oppressed, the church was the only source of hope and comfort. The social order remained unchanged and seemed unchangeable. It was fixed by protocol, framed by law, and frozen in a way of life which most of Europe had abandoned long ago. Personal life, Tsar Nicholas was gentle, quiet, and shy, and his marriage was a love match.
With Alex, the whole world has changed for me. Nature, mankind, everything. All seems to be good and lovable and happy.
The Empress Alex returned his love and added a constant flow of advice.
We have been placed by God upon a throne, and we must keep it firm and give it to our son untouched. And how much easier to be an autocratic sovereign than one who has sworn a constitution. Beloved, listen to me.
William J. Hardy, the English novelist, saw the Tsar.
I saw the Tsar in 1913. It was the tercentenary of the Romanov dynasty. And he was returning to the Winter Palace from the Kazan Cathedral, where they were celebrating the occasion, and he'd just taken Holy Communion. And there he was, crossing this immense Winter Palace square in a small, very elegant room, all by himself, in a sable cap. And he really looked wonderful. His eyes were, they were blue, and they were just like a blue, yearning spring sky. And he was all alone in this brougham, and driven by an elderly, bearded coachman who looked terribly anxious. He had something very precious he was afraid to spill. And from each side, there were Cossacks galloping along with spears, looking terribly fierce. And of course, everybody in the square whipped off his cap.
In the Russian census, the Tsar's profession is entered as landowner, and he personally owned over 6,000 million acres, more than half of all the land in Russia. He and 130,000 other landlords, between them, owned 95% of the country, an empire which stretched nearly 7,000 miles from Germany to Japan, and from the Arctic to the Black Sea. For most of them, change was inconceivable. But there were exceptions. Count Leo Tolstoy, for example, a landowner as well as a novelist, was loved by his villagers, and when he died, they mourned him as a father, carrying banners which said, "To the memory of your goodness."
Before my death, I would like to tell you, the working people, what I have thought about your oppressed position. You are compelled to pass all your life in want and in heavy work, while others who do not work at all profit by what you produce. You are slaves of these men, and this should not be.
Most of Russia's peasants had no reason to love their landlords. The rest of Europe had abandoned slavery centuries before, but in Russia, a man was still owned by his master until 1861. Yet by the turn of the century, many were even worse off as free men than they had been as slaves. Progress was so painful and so slow that a family could live out its whole life without a glimpse of it. That life was a succession of seasons between birth and death. A time to sow and a time to reap, a time to eat and a time to starve. The peasants were uneducated and inarticulate. They were ignorant of politics and philosophies, of socialism or revolution. What they did know was how to starve and how to fear authority. The abolition of serfdom brought one change in the lives of the peasants. They could now leave the land, and they left it in their millions. Of what lay in store for them, they knew little, except that it could be no worse than the life they were leaving behind. They came to the cities, to Kiev, to Moscow, and especially to St. Petersburg, the fastest growing industrial city in Europe, the lovely northern capital where prosperity still trotted quietly across the river Neva. But in the new industrial section of the city, the refugees from the land found no escape from either poverty or squalor. They had simply exchanged one form of bondage for another. They were still peasants, but now urban peasants. Here, industry was largely sustained by foreign investment. In steel from France and Germany and Britain, and coal mainly from France. In the 10 years before the First World War, Russian industrial production more than doubled. Yet productivity remained the lowest in Europe. So, for the most part, did wages and working conditions. Oil was the one industry in which Russia, by tradition, held the lead. And yet, it was here that conditions were often the most primitive of all. Life had changed, but it hadn't improved. It was in these vast industries that men could, for the first time, meet together, discuss their grievances, and talk of political action. Sometimes they spoke of drastic measures for extreme conditions. And a new word entered their daily vocabulary, the word revolution. But for the present, away from the factories and the discontent, Imperial Russia continued to enjoy herself. The Tsar and his Empress were happiest when they were together with their family. And because the Tsar was himself a keen photographer, many of his leisure hours were filmed by the cine cameras of the day. Nicholas knew that his grandfather, Alexander II, had been assassinated in 1881 by a revolutionary group which believed that Russia could only achieve freedom through political murder. The murders took place, but the autocracy continued. 6 years later, there was an attempt on the life of Nicholas's father, Alexander III. The ringleaders were caught and executed, and one of them was a student, Alexander Ulyanov. His younger brother heard the news and swore revenge. Outbreaks of violence continued into the reign of Nicholas II, despite the exiles and the executions. The large houses of the rich were frequent targets. But the new revolutionary leaders realized that the word was more important than the bomb. They handed out pamphlets in the tenements and smuggled illegal literature into the factories. They taught the workers a new weapon of protest, the strike. Revolt spread. Production stopped. Profits were lost. strikers were treated without mercy. They were the enemies of the state and must be suppressed. Tsarist police and the Imperial Army sought out the government's opponents wherever they could, in the countryside as well as in the towns and cities. Many were imprisoned. Many were exiled to Siberia. There is no accurate record of the numbers who were shot. The files of the secret police bulged with the names of known agitators. One of them was the young man who had sworn to revenge the death of his brother. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Lenin came from Simbirsk, a small provincial town on the shores of the river Volga. He was born in this pleasant yellow frame house in 1870. His father's diligence had rewarded him with the office of Director of Education for the region. His mother was an intelligent and serious woman who, like his father, had been brought up in the middle-class tradition of plain living and high thinking. At the age of 4, Lenin posed with his sister Olga. At the age of 9, he took his place in a portrait of the whole family. His report card proves his diligence. He got 5 out of 5 for everything. His favorite brother, Alexander, was arrested in 1887 for his part in the plot to assassinate the Tsar. And in the prison fortress of Schusselburg, he served his sentence of death. Lenin, now 17, was a marked man. The family moved north to Kazan, and it was here that he first read the works of Karl Marx. In his kitchen, young Lenin found a scientific basis for the socialism which remained the driving force behind the rest of his life. A year later, the family moved once more, south to Samara. And here, Lenin started secretly to convert his friends to Marxism. It was while he was at Samara that the province suffered one of the chronic famines which swept across the landscape like a plague. The leading liberals worked anxiously to relieve the sufferings of the peasants, but Lenin refused to join them, and for the first time demonstrated the steely purpose of the practical politician.
This famine is the direct result of the way our society is organized. And as long as society remains unchanged, we shall always have famines. Yet they do cause the peasants to reflect on the facts of our capitalist society, so that they begin to blame the social order for their condition, and their faith in the Tsar and Tsarism is destroyed. This famine could spark off the most serious disturbances, and might even threaten the entire order of society. And so the efforts of the well-to-do to relieve the suffering are quite natural. The truth is that all this talk of feeding the starving is no more than that sugar-sweet sentimentality so characteristic of our intelligentsia.
In In 1895, Lenin settled in St. Petersburg after visiting Switzerland to meet the leading Russian socialists in exile. And for a time, the Russian watchdogs failed to catch him. He studied law, but most of his days were devoted to the revolutionary underground. He was also very short of money.
Dearest Mother, I beg of you to send me, please, a little money, as my own funds have by now almost gone. My landlady is a nagging woman, and when I am not running away from her, I am trying to escape the balalaika which the man in the next room persists in playing.
His life was uncomfortable, and his file in the records of the secret police grew fatter. He escaped them several times, but in the end, his capture was inevitable. Lenin was arrested in Christmas week, 1895, and he spent 14 months in prison without trial. He did exercises to keep fit, and remembering his use of invisible ink as a schoolboy, he smuggled out pamphlets and instructions to his friends. Then, at the age of 27, he was exiled to Siberia. For Lenin, Siberia was easily endured. He had his own house, and time to hunt and skate and walk and argue, and time to think. He learned to be patient and to use Siberia as a training ground for revolution. And from here he sent a message to a fellow exile. Her name was Krupskaya. She answered him simply,
If I'm to be a wife, so be it.
In the spring of 1899, the authorities obligingly let them marry.
We were young then. We had just been married. We loved each other passionately, and that enhanced our exile. For a time, nothing else existed for us.
When the honeymoon was over, they quickly got down to a translation of a trade union history. From his exile in Siberia, Lenin had planned the publication of a new revolutionary paper, Iskra, the Spark. It was now that Ulyanov began to sign himself Lenin. Iskra had to be smuggled into Russia, and the first edition was published in Germany in 1900. But soon the nervous printers forced it to move to England. It was foggy when Lenin and Krupskaya, now released from exile, arrived in London. They rented 2 rooms in Finsbury, where their landlady was disturbed by the fact that Krupskaya wore no wedding ring. Among those who met Lenin at this time was a girl of 17, now Mrs. Zelda Coates.
Well, I first met Lenin at my sister's house, and the first impression I had of him was that he was a rather short, stocky man with very expressive eyes, almost bald he was, so far as I remember, and his hair was very pale, well, almost reddish. My sister had several children, and what struck me also was how very friendly he was with the children. He seemed to, he not only sort of patted them down and that sort of thing like one does with a child, but he entered into their spirits. He started playing with them and had a game with them, and his shouting and laughter was practically as loud and as merry as those of the children themselves.
For Lenin, even the Times had its revolutionary uses. Under the name of Richter, he advertised offering language lessons. He needed the money to keep Iskra solvent. The paper was produced from a small printing shop in Clerkenwell Green in the shadow of the parish church. Here they often worked late into the night, correcting proofs. Lenin, Krupskaya, and a handful of other Russian revolutionaries.
An organization of revolutionaries must contain primarily people whose main occupation is revolution. The organization need not be broad, but it must be as secret as possible.
Lenin liked to study London from the top of a bus and follow the path of his revolutionary forebears, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And Krupskaya noticed his interest.
He liked the bustle of this vast commercial city, and together we saw many of the quiet London squares, all the houses with separate entrances and shining windows. But always tucked away round the corner were the mean streets and the homes of the working people, where lines of washing hung in rows, and pale children played in the gutter. In places like this, we went on foot, and seeing these glaring contrasts of wealth and poverty, Ilyich would mutter,
Two nations. Two nations.
In 1903, the Russian socialists met in a drab London hall. It was now that the future of the revolutionary movement was decided. The party was split down the middle. Lenin's opponents wanted to give party membership to every willing helper.
The more widely the title of member of the party is spread, the better. We can only rejoice if every striker, every demonstrator is able to declare himself a party member.
But Lenin's group was determined that party membership should only be given to a hard core of enthusiasts.
It is better that 10 real workers should not call themselves party members than that one chatterbox should have the right and opportunity to be a member.
Lenin's group won by 2 votes. They became the Bolsheviks, the majority, and the losers were the Mensheviks, the minority.
And there was a fierce discussion as to the tactics to be pursued in Russia at that time. Well, it was soon after the revolutionary events in Russia, and most of the Mensheviks present at that particular gathering, they said, let us have a period of rest now. The workers are tired out. We must not drive them too hard. And now Lenin, on the contrary, he jumped up from his chair in a rather furious mood, which was a little bit out of the common so far as I knew him at the time, and said, that's all nonsense. It's you, messieurs Mensheviks, who are tired. The working class in Russia are not tired, on the contrary. They are full of energy, they are full of desire to fight for their freedom and for the overthrow of Tsardom.
The Tsar himself seemed oblivious of the events which were to decide the fate of his throne, his family, and his country. The date was 1904, and Nicholas was waging a war with Japan to satisfy some dubious territorial ambition. But the formal life of the court continued undisturbed. Far away from this elaborate ceremonial, the Russian armies endured successive defeats and then surrendered to the Japanese at Port Arthur. Lenin dryly noted the disaster.
It is not the Russian people, but the autocracy that has suffered shameful defeat. The Russian people have gained by the defeat of the autocracy. And the capitulation of Port Arthur is only the prelude to the capitulation of the Tsar.
In St. Petersburg, news of the humiliations of the war were followed by the iron cold of January. It had become a winter of discontent. On Sunday, January 9th, 200,000 people marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. They were all unarmed. They carried icons, and many of them chanted, "God save the Tsar." Their requests for better working conditions were modest, but Nicholas decided not to accept their petition.
We're going!
The day is known as Bloody Sunday. Over 1,000 of the marchers were killed. 5,000 were wounded, many of them women and children. But the Tsar found time to write his diary as usual.
It was a hard day. In St. Petersburg, serious disturbances occurred because the workers wanted to come to the Winter Palace. The troops had to fire on them, and there were many killed and wounded. My God, how it hurts me, and it was hard to witness. Mother came to lunch, which we all ate together. Then I took Michael for a walk.
Lenin was in Geneva when the first reports of Bloody Sunday reached the outside world. He was on his way to the library with Krupskaya when he heard the news, and at once they changed their plans and rushed to an emigre cafe where they found their excited Bolshevik friends reading the latest editions of the Swiss papers. Lenin now saw his dreams of a revolution within reach.
There must be an armed uprising, an immediate armed uprising. Talk that we cannot win is the talk of cowards.
In the calm of this Geneva library, he applied himself to the grim techniques of civil warfare. This particular volume, the memoirs of the Russian revolutionaries of the 19th century, still contains his notes in the margins of its pages. In St. Petersburg in October 1905, representatives of the city's workers met for the first time. They called themselves a council. The Russian word is Soviet. And one of their first decisions was to call a general strike. By the end of October, St. Petersburg was at a standstill. With 3 million workers on strike, the Tsar was forced for the first time to make concessions, and he now promised free elections to a national assembly that the strikers were determined to hold out, and their leaders called for an end to the monarchy. Bolshevik fighting brigades, supported by hundreds of strikers, barricaded the streets. The Tsar sent for his Minister of the Interior.
This situation can't last. It's their heads or ours. I order you to take every measure you consider necessary.
The year 1905, which had begun with Bloody Sunday, ended in yet another public slaughter. The power of the Tsar seemed once again to be unchallenged, and the leaders of the Soviet were exiled. The name of its last chairman, a socialist but not yet a supporter of the Bolsheviks, was Leon Trotsky. 3 months later, the promised National Assembly met for the first time, and Lenin attacked it from exile.
The National Assembly is an unsuitable instrument for realizing the victory of the revolution. The Russian government remains a military despotism, embellished with parliamentary forms.
For his part, the Tsar summoned and dissolved the assembly as it took his fancy.
At last it is over. Today I dissolved the National Assembly. The weather was wonderful. After dinner, I read a book and took a boat trip.
This was the age of repression, and the police files of the period record the names of many who were later to play their parts in the October Revolution of 1917. Dzerzhinsky, Joseph Stalin. More than 5,000 executions took place, and 40,000 political prisoners died in jail. Tens of thousands more were condemned to penal servitude in Siberia. One of them was Michael Lebedev.
You're just a thing, they used to tell us. You belong to me, and I'll do what I like with you. Some of them showed even more respect. I feed you if I feel like it, with anything that's around. And if I don't feel like it, you starve. You're not just anything, you're my thing. We were kept in cells that must have been built for anything from 40 to 45 people. And the food, that muck wasn't food at all. We used to call it pig swill. It was just water with a few scraps swimming about in it. God knows what they were. And that was all. Well, so what? After all, a prison's a prison. All human feeling is utterly repressed by it.
In St. Petersburg society, life went on as usual, and the daughters of the well-to-do went about their charitable works. For the Russians are very generous people. Other daughters learned the graceful requirements of a leisured life. This famous academy was known as the Smolny Institute. It was from this very building that Lenin would announce the Bolshevik victory in 1917. fuse was ignited again in 1912 in the Lena goldfield of Siberia, where the miners, threatened with a pay cut, went out on strike. Michael Lebedev was one of them.
They were waiting for a good moment to fire. Suddenly there was a noise like the ripping of canvas. This must have been the first volley. I listened, then there was a second. The workers began to shout. There was an uproar, and then suddenly everyone fell down. I fell too. And as I fell, I saw Demilov next to me, lying somehow strangely on his back, with an unsmoked cigarette in his hand, staring at me. And then I saw a black worm crawl out from behind his ear. I realized it was blood. It was no joke. They were really shooting. Then another volley, and another, then silence.
Lenin moved to Poland after the incident at Lena because he wanted to be nearer events at home. Every day after a supper of soup and meatballs, he would finish off his article for Pravda and take it to the post office. Krupskaya described their life together.
We lived in a small, closely knit circle of comrades. Our friends used to come on walks with us. We were nicknamed the Hikers Party, and we were always being asked to concerts. Ilyich dearly loved music.
The peace and order of their country life makes a strange contrast with the revolutionary passion of Lenin's thought.
The age of the bourgeois democracy is nearly over. Soon it will give way to the age of revolution, when the working classes, organized and trained in the Marxist spirit, will overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish communism.
500 miles away in the Balkan town of Sarajevo, there were celebrations. The date was June the 28th, 1914, and the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand was paying a state visit. Waiting for him in the crowd was a young man with a pistol. Germany declared war on August 1st, 1914, and in Russia, a sudden feeling of unity came to the divided nation. The Tsar made his expected appearance on the balcony, swearing never to make peace while a single foreign soldier remained on the soil of Mother Russia. People cheered him. They knelt to receive his blessing, and some of them called him the great father of his people. The patriotic fever, which was shaking every warring nation of Europe, also gripped Russia. An army of 1.5 million men was mobilized in the first week of the war. Volunteers on their way to the greatest human slaughter ever known. On the bleak battlefields of Eastern Europe, 1 man in every 2 was to become a casualty. The dead often unburied, and the wounded left to freeze in their own blood. At the outbreak of war, Lenin was expelled from Poland and moved to Bern in Switzerland. There he addressed all the available Bolsheviks. They met in a wood outside the town, and Lenin outlined his views on the war.
The defeat of the Tsarist monarchy is a lesser evil than the defeat of Kaiser's Germany. The greater Russia's losses in battle, the sooner will everyone realize that the people have been betrayed. Our task is plain. Total propaganda in the armed forces as well as the civilian population. Our troops must turn their weapons away from the soldiers of the so-called enemy, who are really their own brothers. We must organize illegal groups in the armies of all nations. This war is an imperialist war. We must turn it into a civil war. Now!
For the Bolshevik members of the National Assembly, Lenin's words had immediate results. They were arrested for opposing the war. They were convicted of high treason and exiled to Siberia. Everyone thought that Russia's vast armies would steamroll across Europe, but they were poorly equipped and incompetently led. Hindenburg, the German commander, inflicted a classic defeat on the Russians at Tannenberg in the first month of the war. The German troops cut off and surrounded the Russian army. And in August 1914, the Russians suffered 300,000 casualties, dead, taken prisoner, or severely wounded. The commander-in-chief, the Tsar's cousin, Grand Duke Nicholas, was removed from his post. The Tsar himself took over, but the defeats continued. The soldiers could always put their trust in higher places, a sentiment that was echoed by the Tsar's own Minister of War.
Defeat will be avoided if we put our faith in the protection of St. Nicholas, patron of Holy Russia, and in immeasurable distances.
But 1 man in 3 had no rifle, and many of them hadn't even boots. At the palace of Tsarskoye Selo, where the Empress lived with her invalid son and her daughters, a most extraordinary religious influence prevailed. Rasputin, a drunken and uncouth peasant, had an uncanny hold on the Empress, who believed that his mystic powers could cure her son's illness. As her favorite, Rasputin had wheedled his way into the highest places. His reputation as a lecher never lessened his magnetic attraction for fashionable women. And the Empress was spellbound.
He insists that one must always do as he says. It has a deep meaning.
Hostile cartoonists, however, saw things differently. Under Rasputin's influence, the Empress wrote long and prodding letters to her husband at the front.
My own Nicky, it makes my heart bleed to think that you have to bear so many misfortunes without me. You have such a terrible load on your poor shoulders. No team spirit, no confidence in the officers. But I do hope you will visit the troops as often as you can, and I can picture their joy when they see you. Looking after the wounded is my consolation. To lessen their suffering in a small way helps my aching heart.
The Empress set up her own military hospital near St. Petersburg. It was cleaner and quieter than most. The flood of dying and wounded from the front had increased as the Russian army was pushed steadily back by the forces of Hindenburg. And the reversals of war increased the popular feeling against her friend, Rasputin. In December 1916, Rasputin was invited to the house of Prince Yusupov in St. Petersburg, and while his aristocratic friends played Yankee Doodle Dandy on the gramophone, he was murdered. The Empress was incoherent with grief.
Tonight, a big scandal at Yusupov's house. Big meeting, all drunk. Police heard shots, and they say our friend was killed. I cannot and will not believe it. God have mercy.
The shaken conspirators bundled his body from the house. They had fed him massive doses of cyanide in cakes and wine, and when these had no effect, they shot him through the heart, but he had risen, roaring, to pursue his tormentors. So they shot him again and battered his head in. Finally, they dumped his body in the river. The Russian winter of 1916 was one of the coldest of the century. Transport was disorganized, and power supplies were cut. Bread was hard to find, not because it was scarce, because it was just delayed on the way. Sadly and without enthusiasm, the army shivered its way through the frozen months. After the humiliation of defeat had come the bleak miseries of Russian winter. The broken armies could only endure, wait for the spring, and clear away their dead. home, even the meager war rations failed to get through to the cities, and the people's rumbling discontent erupted into the streets. But the Empress was unmoved.
People are running about shouting they have no bread. They do it only to create excitement. But the thing will pass and settle down, provided the National Assembly behaves.
But the National Assembly was now inciting the people to resist their rulers. On February the 23rd, there was a general strike in St. Petersburg. Nearly 100,000 workmen joined the demonstrations. Stop the disturbances in the capital, the Tsar ordered. But it made no difference. Four days later, the garrison of the city threw in their lot with the strikers, and most of those who mutinied were regular soldiers. It was the turning point. But without military force, there was no means of restoring order, and the fate of St. Petersburg, of Russia, and of the Tsar was now in the hands of the people. In a desperate search for leadership, the demonstrators marched to the National Assembly. In the same building, a council of workers and soldiers was already sitting, a new Soviet. And from this day, it functioned as a rival to the Assembly. Alexander Kerensky, a 35-year-old lawyer, was a member of both the Assembly and the Soviet. He was a gifted orator, and his brave appeal for the overthrow of the Tsar had made him a public idol. When the troops at the front heard of the riots in the capital and were told that the Tsar might fall at any moment, they cheered and laughed and waved their banners like everyone else, thinking, no doubt, that a new government might end the war. On the 2nd of March, 1917, the last of the Romanovs fell with remarkably little fuss. Without even a show of resistance, Nicholas signed the instrument of abdication.
He was very obdurate, and so he had to abdicate. And the members of the Duma boarded his train at the siding, Pskov, and demanded his abdication. And he had to agree. There was nothing else he could do. And what was so tragic was that the official document of abdication contained all his marvelous titles. It began with "We, Nikolai II Alexandrovich, sovereign emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, Tsar of Poland, great prince of Finland and Lithuania, and Tsar of Siberia, Tsar of Pskov." And so it went on, and etc., and ruler and hospodar of many other lands, to all our faithful subjects. But actually, he had very few faithful subjects left. And when he left headquarters for the capital, all his courtiers were leaving him surreptitiously. They were sort of dropping off at obscure stations, and he arrived all by himself, and he fell into his consort's arms, weeping, because he felt that he'd been terribly humiliated. And of course, nobody wanted the Tsar by then, but he actually said to his consort, he said, "Now, if the whole of Russia went down on its knees to me and asked me to return, I would not do it."
The Empress took a different view.
I understand your action, my hero, and I swear upon my life that we shall see you on the throne again, placed there by your people and your army. You will be crowned once more by God himself on earth in your own land.
On the day of the abdication, Alexander Kerensky was photographed in the grounds of the royal palace. The leader of a group of middle-class idealists, he was loudly applauded by the masses.
Such miracles as ours, which transform slaves into free men, happen only once in every century. Let our slogan be liberty, equality, fraternity.
A coalition government was formed of the right and the center. The prime minister was the conservative Prince Lvov, and Kerensky was Minister of Justice. The mob sacked and looted the old Tsarist offices. They destroyed the police headquarters and stormed the jails. Of more practical value was the release of over 1,000 political prisoners. Many were Bolsheviks, who, to the new government's surprise and dismay, immediately attacked it as bourgeois and reactionary. A young man called Molotov was one of those who came home from their Siberian exile. Another was Stalin, the man of steel. At the outbreak of the war, Lenin had taken refuge in Switzerland, and he was now living in Zurich, writing propaganda and keeping in touch with the Bolshevik underground in Russia. When news reached him of the February Rising, he was living above a restaurant in the old quarter of the city. At once, he wrote to Russia with plans of action. He called for an end to the war and appealed to the workers of all the fighting nations to overthrow their governments. He decided to leave his quiet Swiss refuge for St. Petersburg and the revolution as soon as possible. When he left home, Lenin had been away from Russia for over 10 years, and he was traveling with fellow revolutionaries who had spent their exile waiting for this moment. They crossed Germany in a private train, and their safe passage was guaranteed by the Kaiser. The German government saw an obvious advantage in helping those who were so violently opposed to Russia's role in the war. From Germany, the exiles took the Baltic ferry to Trelleborg in Sweden, and then on to Stockholm. There was just time for Lenin to stop for a new pair of shoes and for someone to take this photograph. A group of revolutionaries hurrying to catch up with the revolution. Then they rushed north again, through Finland. At last, on April 3rd, 1917, the long exile was over. 8 days after leaving Switzerland and 6 weeks after the February Rising, Lenin arrived at St. Petersburg. A large crowd met him at the station, and many of them must have expected him to congratulate them on the revolution they believed was won. But for Lenin, the real revolution was still in the future.
When the new government talks to you sweetly and makes big promises, it deceives you. All you get is war, hunger, and landlords. But what you need is peace, bread, and land.
The day after his return to Russia, Lenin addressed the Soviet in the Tauride Palace, and again he surprised his audience with a bitter attack on the government.
Most of our Russian social democrats have betrayed socialism. We want to build the world all over again in the only possible way. By the working class and the poverty-stricken peasants taking power. By the greatest workers' revolution in human history. It is time to cast off the old dirty shirt and put on a new one.
4 weeks after Lenin's return, Leon Trotsky arrived from New York. For the past 12 years, he and his supporters had been bitter opponents of Lenin, but now his brilliance as an orator and organizer were to make him a valuable ally of the Bolsheviks. For a time, the new government seemed to be losing ground. At the end of April 1917, 30,000 soldiers and most of the civilian population of St. Petersburg marched with slogans opposing the war, and May Day was an excuse for the demonstrations to continue. People were enjoying a newly won freedom of speech. Now they used it to call for the overthrow of the government which had granted it. On the battlefields, the Bolshevik peace slogans had immediate appeal. They sent agitators among the troops, and sometimes they even persuaded them that the enemy soldiers really were their brothers. The government, unnerved by army mutinies, made Kerensky Minister of War. Calling for confidence and discipline from the troops, he assured the Allies that Russia would continue to fight. An American delegation welcomed this assurance and recognized the legality of the new government. The British also came and were duly impressed when Kerensky informed them that anti-Bolshevik demonstrations were taking place in the capital. Russia is not a frog for the experiments of Lenin, said the bandits. The Russian battlefront might be crumbling, but at home the women's battalion at least displayed the discipline and loyalty the government demanded. Theirs was a loyalty which was to stand firm until the night of Bolshevik victory in October. For a time, the events seemed to be going Kerensky's way. He visited the front and got an enthusiastic and loyal welcome. And he appointed new generals and launched a new offensive. Generals and the new offensive both failed. After each military defeat, the Bolshevik fortunes rose. For after all, they did keep calling for peace.
They say there is not a political party in Russia which is ready to take full power. I say there is. Our party is ready. We demand the publication of the secret profits the capitalists are making from the war. Then we will arrest them.
But Kerensky was not silent either.
You Bolsheviks suggest childish solutions. Arrest, kill, destroy. What are you? Socialists or policemen?
Tension mounted in St. Petersburg as the summer wore on. The demonstrations were spontaneous and uncontrolled. Neither the government nor the Soviet could handle the situation, and the revolution was in danger of being lost in a sea of anarchy. After 2 days of anger and confusion involving 500,000 people, the Bolsheviks officially backed the rioters, and on July 4th, they were met with violence. Alexander Kerensky became Prime Minister of Russia on July 7th, and at once he acted in the spirit which the shooting had symbolized. He sacked the Bolshevik headquarters, the former home of a ballerina. Warrants were issued for the arrest of the Bolshevik leaders. And for the first time, Lenin was now officially branded as a German agent. But the Bolsheviks helped him to escape, disguised in a brown wig and with his familiar beard now shaven. Using a forged passport in the name of Ivanov, he fled to the north. He went to ground in Razliv, only 20 miles from the violence of the capital. And in the drowsy summer of 1917, he hid in a house here. Like most men on the run, he relied on his friends to bring in the odds and ends he needed.
I want a ribbon for my hat, some powder for my teeth, a cup, and a shaving brush.
After a time, he felt unsafe and rowed across the lake to find a secure hiding place. He set up a primitive home in a small straw hut. Here, using a sawn-off tree stump as a writing desk, he weighed the chances of revolution.
Our membership has more than doubled since April. The army is demoralized, and the peasants are increasingly turning towards us. The government is divided and ineffective, and all the groups except our own are wavering. The bourgeois revolution will pass into the revolution of the working classes. It will happen. Not today, or tomorrow, but very soon.
At Moscow's Bolshoi Theater on August the 12th, the provisional government made a desperate attempt to rally the drifting forces of the country and create some feeling of unity. An all-party meeting was convened to discuss a way out of Russia's dilemma. And more than 2,000 delegates arrived to fill the stalls and balconies of the theater. They were intended to represent every group in the whole unhappy chaos of Russian society and politics. But the Bolsheviks were not among them. They boycotted the meeting, called a strike on the day of the conference, and accused the delegates of not truly representing the people. Out of the long session of empty wrangling, one strong man emerged, General Kornilov, the new commander-in-chief, who was so angered by the prevailing confusion that he took the law into his own hands by military action.
It's time to hang these German spies with Lenin at their head and disperse the Soviet. I want to move a corps to within striking distance of the capital so that when the Bolsheviks demonstrate, we can humble the traitors as they deserve.
Although forbidden by the government, Kornilov's troops advanced on the capital. Kerensky relieved Kornilov of his command, and Kornilov in turn called for the resignation of the government, and his armor moved forward towards St. Petersburg. But Kornilov had seriously miscalculated. The Soviet called on its workers and soldiers to oppose him, and they formed a militia, 25,000 strong, which later became the Red Guard of the October Revolution. Kornilov was resisted by a genuinely popular movement, and at the head of it were the Bolsheviks. Against such resistance, Kornilov's armor spent itself in vain, and even his notorious savage division of the Wild Cossacks was undermined when the grandson of one of its own national heroes joined a delegation to argue it out of its attitude. Those who had resisted Kornilov returned to the city, and the victor was not the government, but the Bolshevik Party. Trotsky, freed from imprisonment in mid-September, was elected president of the St. Petersburg Soviet. And for the first time, the Bolsheviks had a majority in the Soviets of both St. Petersburg and Moscow. Their fortunes, so low in July, were rising fast. In this house on October 10th, the Bolshevik Central Committee met, and by 10 votes to 2, supported Lenin's proposal for an armed insurrection. The minutes were in his handwriting.
The position is clear. Either a dictatorship of the Kornilov sort or a dictatorship of the people. The masses have given us their confidence, and they ask not for words, but for deeds.
In the Smolny Institute, formerly the Young Ladies' Academy, the Bolsheviks organized the insurrection, and the scene was described by the American reporter John Reed.
The Institute had been taken over by revolutionary organizations of workers and soldiers. Within were more than 100 rooms. On their doors, enameled plaques still informed the passers-by that within was ladies' classroom number 4 or teacher's bureau. But over these hung crudely lettered signs, evidence of the vitality of a new order. Central Committee of the Soviet, or Union of Socialist Soldiers. The long, vaulted corridors, lit by rare electric lights, were thronged with the hurrying shapes of workmen and soldiers, and the sound of their boots made a deep and incessant thunder on the wooden floor. The landings were heaped with pamphlets and political literature.
On the 23rd of October, Bolshevik battalions left to take up their positions in the streets. And although the Kerensky government knew what was going on, it did very little to stop them. The government suddenly found itself short of armed support. The best it could muster was the still faithful battalion of women. And some cadets, and some students, with a cycle regiment in reserve. At the Winter Palace, the defenders built barricades against the expected attack. At the Smolny Institute on October 24th, the Bolsheviks made their final plans for the revolution. Their leaders were now working without sleep. early hours of October the 25th, the Bolshevik fighting brigades left Smolny to seize the key points in the city. The railway stations, the state bank, the telephone exchange, the main bridge across the river. The revolution had begun. On the cruiser Aurora, the Bolshevik commissar was Alexander Belishev.
The surrounded area was lit up by our electricians, making it possible for the armed brigades of workers, soldiers, and sailors to converge on the center of the town and surround the Winter Palace. Towards the evening, an order was received concerning the preparations for firing a shot on the Winter Palace. This was supposed to take place at 9 o'clock. But after a delay, when the signalers reported at 9:45 that they had received a signal from the Peter Paul fortress, I, as commissar, gave the order for a shot to be fired on the Winter Palace.
Russian history. We shall end the war. We shall destroy landed property. We shall have a genuine workers' control of industry. Long live the World Socialist Revolution!
Next morning, crowds gathered in front of the Winter Palace and wondered. Within 8 months, first Tsarism and now liberal democracy had been destroyed. Only Kerensky had escaped before the palace fell. The Tsar and his family were soon murdered by the Bolsheviks, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, led by Lenin, now ruled the country. In only 10 days, the revolution had transformed Russia and shaken the world.
It was on the 11th day that the snow came. In the morning, we woke to window ledges heaped white and snowflakes falling so whirling thick that it was impossible to see 10 feet ahead. The mud was gone. In a twinkling, the gloomy city became white, dazzling. In spite of the revolution, all Russia plunging into the unknown and terrible future, joy swept the city with the coming of the snow. Hidden was all the grayness. Only the gold and colored spires and cupolas with heightened barbaric splendor gleamed through the white snow. Even the sun came out, pale and watery at noon. The colds and rheumatism of the rainy months vanished. The life of the city grew gay, and the very revolution ran swifter.
Red Square, Moscow, 50 years later, where once the well-to-do drove sedately in their carriages. A long queue walks towards the tomb of Lenin. They come from every corner of their enormous country, many millions of them every year, and in snow as well as sunshine. In 50 years, the Russian people have achieved much and endured much, an industrial transformation unique in history, and the total destruction in war of 80% of those industries, from the dark ages to nuclear energy for peace or for war. From Lenin's first victory through a civil war and the wild purges of Stalin to a careful coexistence and a personal freedom greater than at any time since the days that followed the abdication of Nicholas II. But who dare say where the road they began to travel in 1917 will finally lead them, and us.